Hello and welcome. It's 10 a.m. on Tuesday, the 1st of July. You're tuned in to our mid-morning newscast here on ARIRANG TV. Let's take a look at what's making the headlines. In a historic move that'll provoke condemnation from Seoul and Beijing, Japan's Abe administration is expected to approve the reinterpretation of the constitution to allow Tokyo to come to the military aid of an ally under attack. Shortly after firing missiles into the East Sea, North Korea proposes that the two Koreas halt hostile military activities and all cross-border slandering from this Friday. Plus, France reaches the quarter-finals of the World Cup with a 2-0 win over Nigeria. Germany advances after a thrilling 2-1 extra-time win against Algeria. But our top story this morning, a historic shift is taking place in Japan today. Despite strong opposition from inside the country, the Abe administration is shifting its more than 6-decade-long pacifist policy to that of collective self-defense, which essentially paves the way for Tokyo to come to the military aid of an ally under attack. Speaking to reporters earlier today, a ruling Liberal Democratic Party lawmaker said the country's ruling parties have agreed to a government proposal to end the ban that has kept the military from fighting overseas since the Second World War. The change, expected to be adopted in a cabinet resolution later today, will significantly widen Tokyo's military options. Opponents say the reinterpretation will kill Japan's long-standing pacifist constitution. The move is also setting off alarm bells in Seoul and Beijing, who both share a mutual mistrust of Tokyo's past military aggression. Now, Korea's National Assembly has moved forward with a condemnation of Japan's recent moves to backtrack on its landmark apology for wartime sex slavery. Our Choi You-sun has this report.
Calling Tokyo's review of the 1993 Konex statement an historical provocation, Korean lawmakers in a resolution adopted on Monday accused Japan of contradicting itself by denying the essence of its past apology. The Abe administration recently claimed that Seoul and Tokyo negotiated the content of the apology after lacking evidence to confirm the Japanese military's wartime sex slaves were forced into prostitution. In a 1993 statement, Japan acknowledged its military was involved in the establishment and management of military brothels and that the coercion of women by private recruiters was done at the request of the military.
The Korean National Assembly makes clear that the Kono statement was publicized based on the findings of the Japanese government's own investigation and was not the result of Korea and Japan's negotiations.
The Korean lawmakers denounced the Japanese government for damaging the spirit of cooperative ties in Northeast Asia, warning such a provocative act would only serve to isolate Japan from the international community. Lawmakers called on Seoul to search for additional evidence that the Japanese military coerced women from Korea and other Asian countries. Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se at the parliamentary committee meeting vowed to respond firmly to any attempt by Tokyo to distort history.
Beyond Seoul-Tokyo ties, the Korean government will treat the issue from a universal humanitarian perspective and cooperate with the international community to increase pressure on Japan.
Seoul is expected to release a white paper on the so-called comfort women by July of next year, detailing the damage done to victims and exactly how the women were coerced by the Japanese military. Choi You-sun, ARIRANG News.
The top military officials of South Korea, the US and Japan will hold talks on this Tuesday on North Korea and other key security-related issues on the sidelines of the ongoing RIMPAC exercises taking place right now in Hawaii. Officials say Seoul's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chae Yun-hee, will sit down with his US counterpart Martin Dempsey and Shigeru Iwasaki from Japan to discuss ways to counter the nuclear threat posed by Pyongyang. The US-led trilateral meeting will end with a joint statement by the three commanders. The RIMPAC exercise, which kicked off just a few days ago at the end of June, is the world's largest international naval drill, with 23 countries taking part. Now, this year's exercise is especially significant as China is taking part in the US-led drill for the very first time. North Korea has proposed an end to hostilities with the South, but as you might expect, there were a few conditions attached to Monday's offer. The North's National Defense Commission said it was also ready to suspend all acts of verbal provocation and slander from this Friday, and it urged Seoul to follow suit. Shin Se-min reports.
No military provocations from either North or South Korea starting at midnight this Friday, July 4th. That was a proposal made by the North National Defense Commission. Pyongyang's top military body also called on both sides to stop slandering each other. The statement makes specific mention of South Korea's joint military drills with the United States, dubbed the Ulchi Freedom Guardian exercises, scheduled to begin this August, and calls for them to be halted while the 2014 Asian Games are taking place in the South Korean port city of Incheon. The North has previously said it would send athletes to the event, which runs from September 19th to October 4th. And experts say Monday's offer had Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to the South later this week in mind.
With President Xi's visit to Seoul, the North is trying to put the blame on the South for not expressing its will to ameliorate the stalled inter-Korean relationship. Pyongyang is also showing its discontent over the continuous joint military exercises between Seoul and Washington by mentioning the Ulchi Freedom Guardian drills.
Other experts see the North offer as a conciliatory gesture, pointing out that it uses softer language than past offers of the same ilk. They also cited the timing of the proposal as it coincides with the joint communique agreed upon by the North and South on July 4, 1972, which outlined the steps for achieving a peaceful reconciliation. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
Now, just a little over 10 years ago, one day over 10 years ago, in fact, the two Koreas began operations of their jointly run Kaesong Industrial Complex, which is in the North Korean border city of the same name. Now, for a look at how far the Inter-Korean Cooperation project has come over the last decade, and also perhaps what the future might hold in store, our Hwang Sung-hee reports.
On June 30th, 2004, 15 South Korean companies began running factories at the North Korean border city of Kaesong. 10 years later, the Kaesong Industrial Complex has seen significant growth. The number of South Korean businesses has jumped from 15 to 125, and the number of North Korean workers from 6,000 to 52,000. The production volume at the factory zone has increased over 30-fold from $15 million to nearly $470 million at present. But the complex has had its struggles. Last year, North Korea unilaterally suspended operations for 5 months amid escalating inter-Korean tensions. The two Koreas have held 5 rounds of talks to prevent a recurrence of similar incidents, but have failed to make much progress.
The two Koreas do not have a framework for ministerial-level dialogue, and almost all inter-Korean cooperation is at a standstill.
But despite the risks, South Korean businesses find Kaesong Complex attractive. The Kaesong Complex offers cheap labor at a cost of around $150 a month per worker, and goods are transferred over land, which means they can be on the shelves the day they're manufactured.
Small and medium-sized firms in South Korea struggle after 5 years in business, but those in Kaesong are flourishing even after 10 years. The two Koreas have formed an economic community, which we see as a small reunification.
The Kaesong Complex is now taking baby steps towards globalization, with around 20 foreign companies showing interest in investing in the joint business park. But concerns about stability are holding the companies back. Hwang Sung-hee, ARIRANG News.
South Korea will welcome Chinese President Xi Jinping to Seoul this week in a visit that could potentially signal a significant shift in the region's extremely complicated power dynamics. The Chinese leader, breaking with tradition in visiting the South before his country's traditional ally in Pyongyang, will discuss ways to help denuclearize the Korean peninsula during his talks with South Korean President Park Geun-hye. Park Ji-won reports.
This week's trip will mark the first time ever for a Chinese leader to visit South Korea before North Korea. Chinese President Xi Jinping will visit Seoul for 2 days starting this Thursday in a visit that is expected to send a strong message to Beijing's traditional ally. Relations between China and North Korea have soured recently. Beijing was not happy when Pyongyang went ahead with a third nuclear test in February of last year, despite China's warnings. China's leadership was also deeply disappointed by the purge and subsequent execution of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's uncle Chang Song-taek late last year. Chang, who enjoyed a good relationship with Beijing, have made major contributions to an expansion of commercial ties with China, while measures to end Pyongyang's nuclear program are expected to top the agenda during their bilateral summit talks. President Xi and South Korean President Park Geun-hye will also discuss other issues, including ways to deepen their economic cooperation. Watchers say that as China is South Korea's top trade partner and South Korea has the highest number of Chinese language proficiency test takers, it's only natural the two countries' ties have strengthened. The summit meeting also signifies a shift in multilateral relations in Northeast Asia, where the traditional Cold War front of South Korea, the US and Japan versus North Korea, China and Russia is looking increasingly more complex. While South Korea and China continue to butt heads with Japan over various historical and territorial disputes, Japan and North Korea are taking strides to normalize their once frosty bilateral relations. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News. Said that a team of South Korea.
Get connected to Korea and the world. Join us every weekday for the latest developments out of Korea, Asia, and beyond. On air, on your mobile, and online, we lead the way every day. ARIRANG News.
To try and resolve the crisis in Ukraine, the European Union also offers $15 billion. Now, turning to some economic news now, and Korea has once again delayed a key decision on liberalizing its rice market. But with a very important World Trade Organization deadline fast approaching, the government won't be able to put it off that much longer. Hwang Jie reports.
Time is running out, but the Korean government is putting off a final decision on rice market liberalization. The government was going to announce its position over the issue at an economy-related ministers' meeting on Monday, but instead said more time was needed to reach a consensus.
We will gather more opinions from the parliament and other related parties to draw a reasonable conclusion on how to develop the nation's rice industry based on the analysis.
The delay comes amid strong protests by local farmers who say the market liberalization is all about protecting food sovereignty. The government is now likely to aim for mid-July after a public hearing on the issue at the National Assembly on July 15th. Korea must notify the World Trade Organization by the end of September on whether it plans to open its rice market. Under a 1994 agreement with the WTO, Korea had promised to liberalize its rice market, but because rice is a staple food of the nation, the government was allowed to put off the move for 20 years in exchange for gradually raising its rice import quota. The 20-year period is set to expire at the end of this year. The government earlier this month said it's moving toward opening up the rice market, saying that raising the import quota even more to delay opening the market simply costs too much. A high-ranking official at Korea's Agriculture Ministry says that while the official announcement has been delayed, the government maintains that rice market liberalization is inevitable. Hwang Jie, ARIRANG News.
Now, it's some good economic news because Korea's overseas construction orders hit a record $37.5 billion in the first half. That's up 22% from last year. This puts Korea well on track to meet its yearly goal of $70 billion. The figures were given a nice boost on Monday when Hyundai Engineering and Construction announced that it had secured a $4.8 billion deal, this to expand a refinery in Venezuela. Korea's biggest builder entered the continent just 4 years ago and started to make inroads in Venezuela 2 years ago. The Korea New Exchange, or as it's otherwise known, the Konex, marks its first anniversary today. Korea's third stock market platform was designed specifically for the nation's smaller companies to raise some capital. It was born out of President Park Geun-hye's vision to promote an environment where startup businesses can flourish. So, how well is the market doing so far? Our Kim Ji-yeon reports.
This Tuesday marks the one-year anniversary of the foundation of the Korea New Exchange, or Konex, a stock market tailor-made for startups. Konex was set up to make it easier for small companies to raise funds and reduce their reliance on bank loans to start and run businesses. More than 55 companies are listed in the Konex with a total market value of $1.2 billion. Konex falls in line with President Park Geun-hye's initiative toward a creative economy, which envisions a convergence of creative ideas and entrepreneurship to create new jobs and markets. Kim Gun-ho, the president of the Konex Association and FN Guide Incorporated, which is listed on the Konex, says his company is building experience and taking an important step toward being listed on the tech-heavy Kosdaq.
Listed companies think it's a crucial step, a trial and error period to build a relationship with potential investors before listing on the Kosdaq. But most of them have not gained financially from listing on the Konex, not yet at least.
The lack of participation in the Konex has been pointed out as a deficiency. The amount of transactions in an average day is less than $198,000, with less than 48,000 shares traded daily. So to induce more investors, the government has lowered the standards of qualifications. The Financial Services Commission reduced the required deposit by 1/3 to 100 million Korean won, around $99,000. The commission also slashed the minimum number of trading units from 100 shares to 1 share, the same as the Kosdaq. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
And it's time now for a look through the international headlines we're following on this Tuesday morning. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim, standing by at the news centre. Good morning, Eunice.
Hello, Mark.
Now, in Ukraine, there had been hope of another extension on the ceasefire there, the tentative ceasefire, but it looks like Kiev is going to let it expire for now, at least.
That's right, Mark. It was set to expire Monday night local time. That deadline has passed, and we're now hearing that Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko will end the 10-day-old truce and relaunch military operations against what he called terrorist units and gangs of marauders. The government had criticized the rebels of violating the ceasefire on numerous occasions, even as it was in place. Poroshenko also cited as reasons for his decision the absence of concrete steps to de-escalate the crisis and to strengthen control over borders from the Russian side. Earlier, the French presidential office had said Ukraine and Russia agreed to work on a bilateral ceasefire following four-way talks amongst leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany. The 3 Israeli teenagers who had been missing for weeks were found dead in a pit in the West Bank. 2 were 16 years old and 1 19, last seen hitchhiking home at a junction near Hebron. Israeli officials had maintained the young men were kidnapped by Hamas, a charge Hamas had dismissed as stupid and baseless. A spokesman for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said all of Israel was mourning the 3 teens, quote, brutally murdered by the Hamas terrorists. In an emergency security meeting with his cabinet, the Israeli leader promised Hamas will pay. The U.S. State Department had urged restraint from both Israel and Palestine. The FBI is also investigating the abduction as one of the 3 was an American national. The battle for Tikrit continues this morning, one day after the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant declared an Islamic caliphate across Syria and Iraq. Helicopters hit ISIL posts overnight as residents spoke of clashes in the southern outskirts. Iraqi forces have been fighting to expel the Sunni insurgency, doggedly holding on to the northwestern city and Saddam Hussein's hometown since its fall last month. Reaction to ISIL's naming its leader as the Imam and Caliph for Muslims everywhere was mixed. While followers welcomed the news, others in Syria and Iraq condemned it. A spokesman for the rebel group Army of Islam called ISIL delusional, adding a state cannot be created through looting, sabotage, and bombing. And finally, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled private companies can seek an exemption from a mandate for birth control as outlined in Obamacare. In a vote of 5-4, the justices ruled in favor of 3 family-owned businesses, saying they can object on religious grounds to provide insurance covering birth control for women. They cited a 1993 federal law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, enacted to protect religious liberty. The companies in the case said they did not object to all birth control, but certain types they saw as amounting to abortion, which they did oppose for religious reasons.
And a good Tuesday morning to you all as we get back into our regular sports news starting off in the LPGA. Now, not too long ago, South Korea's Park In-bi was the #1 golfer in the world, but now, well, she's ranked 3rd. With Stacey Lewis claiming the Walmart Northwest Arkansas Classic over the weekend, the American remains #1 in the latest LPGA ranking for the 5th straight week. But Park In-bi, who finished tied for 15th, dropped down to 3rd after teenage sensation Lydia Ko, who finished tied for 2nd, was bumped up to 2nd in the latest world rankings. Meanwhile, Korean-American Michelle Wie, who's been enjoying a nice season so far, has gone up 1 spot to #6 overall. And now it's been a while since we've covered the KBO, so with the league approaching its mid-season soon, let's now take a look at how the teams look so far. And of course, taking a look here, the Samsung Lions continue to run away with the league, taking a 6-game lead over the NC Dinos, who are in 2nd place, with Nexon and Lotte closing out the top 4 spots. Now, the Doosan Bears have really been struggling in the month of June and are 12.5 games behind Samsung and 3.5 games back of the Lotte Giants. Meanwhile, Hanwha still being Hanwha despite the big signings this past offseason, as they're in last place, with the LG Twins just ahead of them in 8th place. And now staying with the KBO, just like I said, mid-season is approaching, which also means that the KBO All-Star Game is just around the corner. And after weeks of voting, we have a young star leading the voting. And leading the overall All-Star voting is NC Dinos' Na Sung-bum, who's just in his 2nd year in the professional league, has been dominating the voting so far. While Kang Jung-ho leads the online voting by 8,000 votes, the NC Dino Slugger leads the phone app voting by over 12,000, giving him the most votes overall so far. The 24-year-old is currently hitting .360 with 17 home runs and 59 RBIs. And now let's finish things off with the 2014 Brazil World Cup coverage with 2 exciting matches kicking off earlier today, starting off with France taking on Nigeria. Now, a relatively close match all throughout the first half as the Nigerian goalkeeper Vincent Anyema keeps it close with some amazing saves. But in the 79th minute, a key mistake off of a corner as Paul Pogba scores the first goal for a 1-0 lead. Nigeria looking for a last-minute equalizer, but an own goal by Joseph Yobo in the 90-plus ends their dreams as France advances with a 2-0 victory. Meanwhile, Germany and Algeria facing off. Algeria just dominating in the first half as the German defense barely hang on to keep it a 0-0 draw after the first half. Both sides going back and forth in the second half as the second half ends in a 0-0 draw as well. But Andre Schürrle and also Mesut Ozil scores in the extra time, followed by a last-minute goal by Algeria as Germany hangs on to win it 2-1 as they advance to the next round. And that's going to wrap it up for me. This has been SJ. Have a great rest of the day and see you guys again for your sports needs. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for now, but we will be back for another newscast at noon Korea time. Until then, goodbye.